Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. This is Michael Marchuk, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, Jeff Wald. Jeff holds an MBA from Harvard University and a master's and bachelor's degrees from Cornell University. Jeff is the author of the recently published book, The End of Jobs, The Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. He's the founder of several technology companies and an active angel investor and startup advisor, as well as serving on numerous public and private boards of directors. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's great to be here.
You are so busy, I don't know how you have time to write a book.
Well, it did take me about 7 years.
Okay. Well, I imagine a lot changed in those 7 years, too, as you were writing it.
It did. There were many chapters that needed to be rewritten as technologies became obsolete and new and better observations were being made about the future of work.
I can imagine that. So in your book, you mentioned that robots and AI are viewed as the fourth revolution. As we look at the first three, they focused on mostly the industrial or manufacturing, but the fourth revolution is different. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the first point of the book was to look at history in order to see what kind of lessons we could learn, because society's been through these changes before. What do we do when a new technology comes out, like robots and AI, that has such a massive productivity increase that you have the fear that companies no longer need the same number of workers? And that leads everyone to freak out and go, oh my gosh, there aren't going to be any jobs. And a lot of people look at the fourth industrial revolution the same way they look at the first three. And they say, well, it'll probably be the same. We'll end up with ever more jobs at an ever higher standard of living while working fewer hours. And those are very clear data trends that exist through the first three industrial revolutions. The question one needs to ask is, well, what might be different this time? This change is going to happen much quicker than the other changes. This change will happen over a 20-year period versus a 150-year period for some, 100-year period for others. This change is going to happen globally at the same time. This is not a technology being developed in Cromford, England to increase the manufacturing yields in textiles and slowly making its way to Lowell, Massachusetts. This is a update on an iOS device with a new Siri with all kinds of AI features that's hitting 1.5 billion devices globally overnight. And so when you think about the global nature of the change and the speed of the change, it does make us think that maybe this will be different. But I am reminded of one of my favorite lessons from business school, which is the 5 most dangerous words in business are, this time it is different.
Very much so. I agree with you. We've seen that over and over again. History does tend to repeat itself in interesting ways with different nuances. One of the interesting things that struck me, and before you even opened the book, the one thing that struck me was from the title, you mentioned an Agile corporation. Can you describe what that is and why it's so important?
Sure. Well, an Agile corporation, Michael, is a company that has variabilized a good amount of its cost, and therefore it's able to very quickly respond. And so as companies think about more on-demand labor is taking what is most companies' largest cost, labor, and turning it from a predominantly fixed cost into a more variable cost. That's how we get to an Agile corporation.
I see. So corporations are looking to streamline their operations, for efficiency and whatnot. And I know there's been numerous studies from the World Economic Forum report that looks a few years out. But there's other reports from McKinsey, Bain, Oxford, et cetera, that look 10 plus years out. And your book is even looking further out than that. Obviously, predicting the future is nearly impossible. Can you describe some of the trends that are driving these changes that are affecting the future of work?
Well, first and foremost, let me give a huge shout out to the World Economic Forum's team and that specific report. I'm going to tell you, if your listeners are going to read one thing about the future, well, actually, if they're going to read one thing, they should read my book. But if they're going to read two things, they should read that World Economic Forum report. Look, some of the trends that we look at, both in the near term in the book and in the long term, include things around total talent management, the idea that in an Agile corporation context, we're going to manage those on-demand workers, those variable labor resources, right alongside our full-time workers. They include things around convergence, this idea that everything that the on-demand worker faces today are permeating the full-time labor force. And so while the subtitle of the book is The Rise of On-Demand Workers, Michael, I don't mean to imply that we're all going to be Uber drivers. Very far from it. What I'm saying is the things that drive the Uber driver's life, the things around personal responsibility, task-based labor, HR driven entirely by data, algorithms allocating work, all of those things are becoming the reality for all workers, not just the Uber driver.
So when you mentioned this talent pool and the on-demand labor and this need to look at a convergence of this in the future, how does digital labor or robots from a software perspective factor into this talent pool?
So increasingly companies are breaking work down into tasks. So it's no longer, you work for one manager and you go in, you find out what you're going to do for the next couple weeks, and then you go and do it. You increasingly are given very discrete tasks. Those tasks can be done by all sorts of labor resources. They could be done by full-time employees, and certainly we want to make sure all our full-time employees are 100% utilized. But they can also be done by temps or freelancers or vendors or an AI system. So as we start breaking work down into tasks, we start to see which tasks are kind of the key word, repetitive, high volume tasks. If I'm breaking work down and I see that there are a series of tasks, that it's the same task over and over again, then we have a high degree of probability that that task will be eventually done by a machine. Now, whether that machine is a robot on a manufacturing line, because that same repetitive task was screwing in a bolt at this point in the car's chassis, in which case that job is now done by a machine, or whether that task is the taking in and out of money from a bank, that task is now mostly done by a machine, an ATM, or whether that task is doing a series of accounting entries, but it's the same accounting entry at the same point in time in the day all the time, that task will start to very slowly not be done by a person inputting information, but by an AI system.
So it sounds like you're aligning the right work with the right resource, which may depend on the tasks that are at hand.
100% correct. Everybody likes to look at a piece of technology and say, oh my gosh, because that technology exists, there won't be any more accountants. There won't be any more lawyers. And it's really dangerous to assume that. Aligning the right task with the right labor resource is vitally important. And, one of the other main things we talk about in the book is how do companies actually engage workers? There's this misnomer that companies, as soon as a new technology exists, oh, well, now that exists, they're going to get rid of all that staff. Or as soon as anything happens, oh, well, now people can use workers in India everywhere. They're just going to outsource everything to India. It wasn't true with workers in India. It won't be true in regards to RPA. RPA will be seen as a tool to help workers get their jobs done more effectively, not to displace workers.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and we're seeing that in our industry as well. So you're seeing also this convergence of technologies that are impactful, sort of each on their own. So we have 5G, AI, RPA, blockchain, battery storage, renewable energy, pervasive connectivity. All these things are on their own providing additional benefits based on the specific aspects they're being leveraged for. But when you see this confluence, do you see any way that organizations can start leveraging this again to plan for their future strategies?
Well, when I talk to organizations, it's mostly in the context of, well, everybody wants to know, well, what's it going to look like in 20 years? And I always start with, well, what are you doing now? Do you have the data right now to understand two important things? One is, what skills do you have in your company today? And most people can't answer that question. When you look at an on-demand worker's profile, whether it's on an Upwork or a TaskRabbit or in a company like WorkMarket, the last company I started, you see tons and tons of data on that worker. But when you look at a company's HR file, the profile of a worker in a company's HRMIS system, there's very little information about that worker. So we know more about our on-demand workers than we know about our full-time workers. So that first question of what skills do you have in your organization today, most companies can't answer. And then the second question is, do you understand the tasks that are performed at your company today? And again, most companies can't answer that. So let's not worry about where the world's going. Let's try to get the data first and foremost about what we're doing today, and do we have the skills to match the tasks? And then let's start to think a few years out for that company, in that industry, in that geography. How are those skills needs going to evolve? And how are we going to respond to them?
That makes sense. That makes sense. So we look at the technology. It's one aspect to apply technology, but it's understanding what you're using the technology for in the first place, so whether or not it applies to you or how you're going to leverage it in your upcoming strategy. The challenge I see too is technology tends to change a lot faster than people change. And so as these technological advances shape the way the job roles are, how can people adapt to these newer roles? I mean, because you think about the short term from baby boomers and Gen Xers, they have certain level long runway. And you look at longer term to like the millennials and the Gen Zs, they may be looking at something very different. So how can we take this technology, which is changing, but also adapt people to that kind of change?
Well, I will tell you this. You are 100% correct. People don't adjust to change well. Companies don't adjust that well. Societies adjust incredibly poorly. And so as we think about how rapidly these changes are coming, it is something to be very, very mindful of. I will also say this. The amount of time in which a skill becomes obsolete is now compressing at a very, very rapid rate. It used to be you went to school from 18 to 24, whether that school was university or a technical school or an apprenticeship, whatever it was, that was when you got all the skills you basically needed to monetize until your retirement. And that worked well. We are now in a situation where most skills are starting to become obsolete over a 4 to 6 year period, which is to say that you constantly need to refresh those skills and reinvent yourself. And I'll close on this thought with this. There is a phrase that some people say, oh, God, that phrase is so overused. And I would argue it's not used enough. And that is lifelong learner. It's one of those buzzwords in the world of work today, but it is so painfully and so powerfully true that everybody has to become a lifelong learner, has to constantly be thinking about what skills do I have that are monetizable, and are they becoming obsolete? And you have to constantly refresh those skills. And for waiting for somebody else to do it, waiting for your company to upgrade your skills, no. As we said in regards to convergence, personal responsibility is one of these massive trends that is occurring in the world of work. Nobody owns your career development more than you do. So be a lifelong learner.
That makes total sense. I would definitely advocate for that as well. So you've run a number of companies and you've sold them to larger entities like ADP and Salesforce. Obviously, each industry and company is going to have its own challenges and opportunities, but do you see any commonalities that executives in these service industries that are being impacted with this fourth revolution should be planning for right now? I mean, in other words, if you were in the shoes of a banking executive or insurance executive, what would you be doing right now to plan for this oncoming revolution?
Well, I think one of the first things I'd be doing is talking to you and your team, and I don't mean that just because you had me on your podcast, but I think it is vitally important to understand RPA, and it is a powerful trend that is going to massively accelerate. And in order to understand it, you got to go back to, do you understand the tasks that are being performed in your organization? And if you are not at the forefront of this as an executive in any service industry, you are going to get left behind very quickly. And so whether you're the person running the company or running a division or running a team, you need to be thinking about this, educating yourself, and bringing in the vendors that are really pushing the curve here on what is possible in order to make sure that you are as efficient as possible, delivering as much value for your clients as possible, because you're taking as much cost out of the business using automation where possible.
Amen to that. Okay. So
I didn't think you would disagree with that one.
I don't. I agree wholeheartedly. But it's interesting to take your perspective on it, because you are seeing it from an outside viewpoint, and that's important for us and for our listeners to be able to get this outside perspective that folks who are thinking ahead are looking at these type of technologies right now and believe that they are important. So as we look at your book, the End of Jobs, what do you think is the biggest takeaway message from your book?
I would like to hope that the reader would come away with the following. Be wary of people that make predictions about the future of work. And I mean that in as much as the reason I wrote the book, Michael, is because I was getting very frustrated with seeing predictions that everyone would talk about at conferences. And I would say, that's a ridiculous, that's never going to happen. Like that doesn't make any sense. We have bodies of evidence in the world of work, 3 very specific bodies of evidence. One is the history of work, as we talked about in the beginning of this conversation. 2 are the data trends and patterns, not only throughout history, but as exists in the world of work today. There's huge amounts of data in the world of work. And the 3rd is how companies actually engage workers. And any prediction about the future of work that doesn't take into account those bodies of evidence, be wary. Be very wary, because I'm not saying they won't ever come true. I'm just saying there's a very low likelihood. I'll finish this little part here by telling you a story. I was on a panel the other day, and a gentleman, quote unquote, thought leader in the future of work, said, I think that 50% of the workforce will be remote once COVID is done. And I looked at him, I was like, really? I mean, on Zoom, looked at him, I should say. I said, really, how do you juxtapose your 50% prediction with the fact that only 42% of the US workforce can work remotely? And he said, I didn't know that. I said, well, shouldn't you though? Shouldn't you know that if you're going to make any predictions? And so that'd be an example of a prediction you should be wary about, because it wasn't based on the very clear data that is available. So be wary would be the big takeaway.
That makes sense. Now, finally, your book mentions a very interesting concept or prize, if you will, the Future of Work Prize. And I want you to talk about it and tell me a little bit more about it, because I thought it was really interesting.
Well, I have the pleasure of serving as an advisor to the X Prize. And as I thought about inviting some of the greatest thinkers in the future of work to add their contributions to the book, because I will certainly tell your listeners this, if you're going to write a book, the best way to do that is to get as many people to help write your book as humanly possible. And so I only really wrote half of this book. The other half is written by these 20 great thinkers. And I thought, well, let me make this interesting. Let's, put some money where our mouths are. And so I put up the $10 million as a prize. Now, given that I'm not the X Prize and have much more limited resources than that organization does, I did make this a very long-dated prize. So this will be the one context in which I root for inflation. But these 20 writers wrote their visions of what the world of work looks like. And these are some of the leading CHROs out there, the Chief Human Resource Officers, some of the leading people in the union movement, some of the leading labor regulators and attorneys, and some of the leading technologists. And they were kind enough to spend their time writing, researching, and putting together their view of the world of work in 2040. And so I am matching their ingenuity with the prize, which I will award on January 1st, 2040, to whichever of the writers is the most correct.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Well, Jeff, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. Everyone, Jeff Wald's book, The End of Jobs, The Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations, is available on Amazon and Audible. Actually, I use the Audible version because I love listening to audiobooks. I highly recommend it. So thank you again for your time and your thoughts today. It was really a fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. Stay safe and be well.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.